Hi guys, so welcome to the first of 3 videos that I will be making for the MCAT 2015 series. I will be focusing on Foundational Concept 1, and this video specifically will be talking only about Foundational Concept 1A. Over here I've actually written out what Foundational Concept 1A is, and it is described as the structure and function of proteins and their constituent amino acids. So we're going to focus on this structure and function of proteins in general. So let's start by talking a little bit about what proteins are. A good way to define a protein is that, quite simply, a protein is a biological molecule. Biological molecule. So yes, it is a biological molecule, and there are other kinds of biological molecules as well. Lipids, for example, are another kind. There are starches or carbohydrates, but we are primarily focusing on proteins for this video. So next, let's focus a little bit on the different kinds of proteins that exist in biological systems. Here I've listed various types of proteins and their functions. Firstly, there's the enzyme, and as we all know, enzymes lower activation energy, and this then speeds up reactions. And here I've drawn what looks like a Pac-Man, but for me it's just easier to picture an enzyme as a Pac-Man because it has this mouth region that binds to a substrate. I know this is all review, but it could just help in understanding what exactly an enzyme does. And so the substrate binds to an enzyme's activation site, and this allows for a reaction to progress much faster than it normally would. So that is one kind of protein. The second kind is a structural protein. So for example, these structural proteins allow for a cell to maintain its cell structure that then allows the cell to perform its function. A good example of a structural enzyme is collagen or keratin. Both collagen and keratin are found in skin cells, and keratin is also found in hair cells. So that's one good example of structural enzyme, or structural proteins, I'm sorry. And then there are motor proteins, and we've seen quite a few of these, and probably in high school biology as well. And these proteins convert chemical energy into mechanical energy. And one good example is when you think of the cell respiration cycle or the cell respiration processes, ATP synthase is a type of protein that's embedded in the cell membrane, and it is a motor protein because there's actually a movement that causes ATP to be generated by the hydrogen gradient that is existing in mitochondria. So I know that's maybe a little more complicated and require more explanation, but it's good to know that that is a protein. Another example of this is the troponin-tropomyosin complex. Tropomyosin. And troponin and tropomyosin are important concepts to know for the MCAT as well, and that's why I'm mentioning it here. You could look it up. And then there are receptor proteins that are also important. As we all know, receptors are commonly found on the cell membrane of a cell, and this allows for molecules from the outside to bind to the cell and identify what kind of cell it is. So if we were to take those receptors away, not only would the cell not be able to perform its normal functions, it would also be identified as foreign in the body, and thus the immune system might mount an attack against it. And then the fifth kind I've listed here is a transport protein. So transport proteins usually traverse the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, and this allows for polar molecules to go through the non-polar lipid membrane that exists in cell membranes. Usually polar molecules can't go through that lipid non-polar layer, and that's why having this transport protein that has a channel that goes through it allows for a specific molecule to go through. it is still selective, and that's important to know. And then here I've listed a few other types of proteins as well. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the functions of various kinds of proteins are, let's focus a little more on what the structure of proteins are. So by structure, I mean the actual components that compose what a protein becomes. So from high school biology, we know that proteins are a series of amino acids. And amino acids are known as the building blocks of proteins, the most primary fundamental unit that can give rise to what a protein is. So polypeptides, by peptides we talk about these amino acids, and polypeptide is often described as a protein because you need multiple amino acids to make up a protein. And just so that we can recognize what exactly a series of amino acids would look like, I'm going to draw them as a series of balls, like in a chain, linked together with peptide bonds. And when we look at one of these ball-like structures, this represents one amino acid. The actual chemical structure looks like this. So there's an amine group, and bonded to CH with a variable region, and a carboxylic acid, the other end. So this variable region is what allows for amino acids to be different. So each one of these could be something else. So this one could be tyrosine, this one could be glycine, and so on and so forth. So for example, this R in this case would, if it were glycine, it would be an H, whereas if it were another amino acid, it could be, like a methyl group, a CH3. And that's what the R represents. And that's important because the R is what allows the protein to form its shape. So for example, if we had 3 amino acids like I've drawn here, and one of them in the R group has a carbonyl group on it, and the other one has an H on it, these two can interact, and thus that interaction is what allows that series of amino acids to bend and shape, and that shape is what gives rise to the actual protein, and that is important for its active site. It's important for the various interactions that the protein will make in its function. And so if we were to change the position of an amino acid or change its actual R group or its identity, this shape will change, and thus we're changing the actual protein itself. And when we change a protein from its natural state to something that's not natural, we say we're denaturing the protein. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is that there is actually a hierarchy of protein structure based on their complexity. So here I've labeled primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. And for each category, I've also described what they are for the proteins. So for a primary structure of a protein, it consists of just the series of amino acids. So the balls and the peptide bonds between them are the series of amino acids. The secondary structure, you get multiple series of amino acids linked together or interacting together to form alpha helices and beta plated sheets. And these are just two different shapes that they form when interacting with each other. And then for the tertiary structure, you have multiple alpha helices and beta plated sheets that interact to form a 3D structure. And this is the first time we see the 3D structure of the protein beginning to form. And so this is the 3D structure of the polypeptide. And for the quaternary structure, then we see multiple ones of these, multiple 3D structures or polypeptides that interact with each other, forming one protein. And a good example of this is hemoglobin, for example. Hemoglobin has 4 domains, and it's written HB for short, but it shows up in the MCAT quite often, so that'll be a good one to know. So with that, I'm going to end the first video, and there you have it, structure and function. Thank you.